I have always had a little soft spot for history's forgotten heroes. Those people whose contributions catch but a fleeting mention in the annals of our past, but whose actions have so often quietly contributed to the great achievements of our human story. Consider Michael von Puschberg, the all but forgotten textile merchant who had seen such potential in a young Salzburg composer called Mozart, that he was prepared to lend him money time and time again, notwithstanding Mozart's financial recklessness and his habitually broken promises of repayment. Or Joseph Black, the man whose financial backing of James Watt ultimately bought Watt sufficient time for him to produce such a significant improvement to the steam engine, that the Industrial Revolution would burst forward in a new gear. And while our history books are of course dominated by the frontmen, Churchill and Kennedy, and Mozart and Watt, if one dares to scratch through the surface, history is in fact littered with the little-known men and women who plied their trade quietly in the background. Men like Ian Robertson, who we met, of course, in Friday Story number 1. And indeed, society is slowly coming to recognize that success isn't driven solely by God-given talents. Instead, as observed by Malcolm Gladwell's eye-opening book Outliers, that inevitably there are powerful external factors at play, which had conspired to prepare these people for their success. And today's Friday Story applies this observation to the great man, Nelson Mandela. For few of us have really considered just how unlikely Mandela's success was. Indeed, having been born in 1918 to a very remote little hamlet called Mvezu on the banks of the Mbashi River on the Transkei region of the Eastern Cape, Mandela was almost totally detached from the dynamics shaping South Africa and the world. Or perhaps cocooned is a better description, given the trauma that was sweeping across the planet at the time in the form of World War I. Indeed, on the very day of Mandela's birth, people in London and Paris and New York were awakening to the shocking newspaper headlines that the Russian Imperial Romanov family, the Tsar and his whole family, had been executed the previous day. Another stark reminder to the people of these cities that the world as they had known it was forever changed. But in Mvezu, it is unlikely that this news would have featured in a village celebrating the birth of a healthy little boy, whom his father, the local chief, had named Rolihlahla, meaning troublemaker. And while his parents would no doubt have wished all the very best for their baby boy, not in their wildest dreams could they have imagined that in their arms lay a being that would one day emerge as perhaps the most famous and respected man in all of the 20th century. And while not for a moment hinting that Nelson Mandela wasn't a very special man, his path to success was consistent with the observations of Gladwell, also shaped by a set of critical external factors. I'll mention but a few. Firstly, the tragic death of Mandela's father when he was just a boy of 9. A pivotal moment, because Mandela's father had been a respected counsellor to the acting Tembu king at the time, Jongin Thaba. And Jongin Thaba, out of respect for his late counsellor, decided to raise young Mandela as his own son. A generous decision which saw Mandela bid farewell to his little village, and indeed his mother, and take up a new life at the Tembu royal capital of Mqhekezweni. A move which now exposed young Mandela to a whole new world of opportunity. For he was now sent to the finest missionary schools in the region, and while most of his peers were beginning careers deep underground in the city of gold, Johannesburg, Mandela would instead make his way to law school at the University of Fort Hare, South Africa's only black university. And then, in another twist of fate, during his tenure at Fort Hare, the king announced to young Mandela that his marriage had been arranged, with lobola duly negotiated. Mandela was shocked, for he was, by his own admission, a great romantic. And further, he had it on good authority that his designated bride-to-be was in fact in love with his best friend. And so, in what would be a fateful moment for this country, the 22-year-old Nelson bolted for Johannesburg in order to avoid this arranged marriage. A decision which ripped Mandela away from his sheltered rural life, where his ultimate goal had been to become a translator in the local magistrate's office, and instead he now took up the challenge of life in the huge, vibrant city of Johannesburg. And arriving in Johannesburg with next to nothing, Mandela would rely on support from people for basic survival, food and shelter and clothing. And while Mandela in his autobiography observes that while there is little to be said in favor of poverty, that it was often an incubator of true generosity in others. And today's story involves one of these acts of generosity, a forgotten sacrifice by a man called Gaur Radebe. And what differentiates this act of kindness from others that Mandela received was that, like Michael von Pushberg's backing of Mozart or Joseph Black's support of James Watt, it involved the specific act of recognizing potential and then nourishing it in order to see that potential fulfilled. Now Mandela, who had been studying law at Fort Hare, had, through the help of a young Johannesburg property entrepreneur called Walter Sisulu, been introduced to the law firm of Witkin, Sadelsky and Eidelman, a firm Sisulu had considered to be relatively progressive by the standards of the day, and Mandela was in turn hired. And here, Nelson Mandela was taken under the wing of Gaur Radebe. Radebe was a passionate and political young man who was actively looking to address the grim plight of black South Africans. And despite his lack of formal education, Radebe was, by Mandela's own admission, superior in almost every sphere of knowledge. A man who opened Mandela's eyes to the dire political reality of South Africa. And in the process, Radebe introduced Mandela to the country's oldest resistance movement, the African National Congress, where he began to attend meetings. And Gaur Radebe also inspired Mandela's activism, marching together for the first time in the Alexandria bus boycotts of 1943, which Mandela experienced as both exhilarating and effective. For 9 days later, those increased fares were scrapped. But while Mandela had been in awe of Radebe, quietly Radebe had himself been observing the great potential brewing in young Mandela. But in identifying that potential, Gaur Radebe was faced with a conundrum. Because on the one hand, his own career, notwithstanding his important role at the firm raking in black business, would always be limited by the fact that he had no formal education. Yet, on the other hand, it was clear to him that there was really only room at the firm for one black man. So he knew that his very presence was stopping Mandela from being formally articled by the firm, so stunting the growth of a man in whom he saw such great potential. And so, in a beautifully unselfish moment all but lost to history, Gaur Radebe made the decision to move on, so opening the opportunity for Mandela to grow. "It is important to the future of our struggle in this country for you to become a lawyer," he said to Mandela on his departure. And I believe he was right. For as it turned out, law would play a critical role in Mandela's influence. For having qualified as an attorney, Mandela, together with Oliver Tambo, opened the country's first ever black law firm. A business which, it should be mentioned, was thriving until they were forced by the authorities to close it down. But more than the financial stability it offered, it was Mandela's knowledge of the law which provided him with the clarity and the confidence to lead the struggle movement with such authority. And indeed, many of the key moments which would define Mandela's life leveraged his knowledge of the law. His impeccable handling of the Rivonia trial, his negotiations with the apartheid government in the lead-up to his release, and even in the securing of our constitution 18 months into his tenure as state president, exactly 20 years ago this month. And one is left to ponder just how differently things may have panned out if Gaur Radebe hadn't opened this door for Mandela. Gaur Radebe continued his career in the ANC, rising from the Alexandria branch responsible for those bus boycotts of 43 to the Transvaal Executive Committee and later the National Executive Committee in 1949. But in the late 1950s, Radebe joined Robert Sobukwe of the PAC, becoming their chairman in 1959 before heading into exile following the massacre at Sharpeville in 1960. He ended up in Dar es Salaam and later Zambia, where he would retire. And while this story is about honouring Gaur Radebe's forgotten act of kindness, it is also an important learning in South Africa, because we are a country whose education system is struggling to shake off the shackles of the past and to prepare our youth for a dynamic modern world. And while this legacy is no doubt contributing to our frightening youth unemployment figure, we are also, by implication as a nation, sitting on one of the world's largest resources of untapped human talent. One can only imagine just how many Mozarts and Watts, and indeed Mandelas, are lying dormant and unfulfilled in this country. And our ability to succeed as entrepreneurs, as businesses, as institutions, and indeed as a nation, will increasingly depend on our ability to sniff out this untapped potential in people, and then to generously open doors to them so that they might fulfill that potential.